I moved into the house on a Friday. I'd driven through the neighborhood a handful of times before signing anything, enough to feel like I had a read on the place. It seemed calm, unremarkable in the best way. The kind of street where nothing happens and nobody makes it their business to notice when it does. What I remember most from those early drive-through is how still everything was. Cars in driveways, but no one in yards. Curtains closed in the middle of the afternoon. When the whole block had this quality of being watched from the inside. Like everyone was home, but nobody wanted you to know it. Moving day confirmed it. I had a truck backed into the driveway for 6 hours. Doors open, boxes going in and out, music playing. Not one person came over. Not even a wave from across the street. I told myself that was fine. I wasn't moving here to make friends. I was moving here to disappear for a while, get my head straight, start over clean. I didn't need neighbors. I needed quiet. I got it. What I didn't get, what nobody warned me about, was what was already inside the quiet. The first night passed without anything. I fell asleep on the couch surrounded by boxes, too exhausted to make it to the bedroom. Slept straight through until morning. Normal. Fine. The second night was different. I'd spent the whole day unpacking, hadn't eaten much, and went to bed earlier than I'd planned. The house was finally starting to look like somewhere a person actually lived. I remember feeling something close to relief as I turned the lights off. I don't know exactly what woke me. It wasn't a loud sound. It was more like a pressure, like the house had shifted its weight. I opened my eyes and the room was dark and completely silent. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate scraping coming from outside. Rhythmic, patient, like something being dragged back and forth across the same strip of ground, over and over, at 2 a.m., while the rest of the street slept. I lay there and listened for almost a full minute before I moved. I should have called someone right then. I know that now. I got up slowly, like any sudden movement might break whatever strange spell was holding the moment together. The scraping continued, steady, unhurried, as I crossed the room and pulled the curtain back from the window. There was a man in my driveway, tall, dressed head to toe in dark clothing, heavy jacket, dark pants, gloves. He moved in a long, methodical rhythm, dragging something across the concrete and releasing it, dragging and releasing, over and over. It took me a second to register what he was doing. He was shoveling, clearing the driveway. At 2 a.m., in near total darkness, without a single light on, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stood at that window for what I can only estimate was 3 full minutes. I couldn't move. Part of me was searching for an explanation that made this okay. Maybe he was a neighbor. Maybe this was some kind of welcome gesture. Maybe people just did this here, and I didn't know about it yet. But no explanation I ran through made the feeling in my chest go away. There was something deeply wrong about the way he moved. Too slow, too focused, like he wasn't doing me a favor. Like he was doing something he'd done 100 times before. I went downstairs. I pulled on my shoes and jacket at the front door, told myself I was just going to introduce myself, figure out what was going on, maybe thank him and ask him to come back at a reasonable hour. I turned the handle and stepped outside. He was gone. I stood on the porch and looked at the driveway, empty. The street beyond it, empty. Every house dark, every yard still. And the only evidence that anyone had been there at all was the work itself. Half the driveway cleared, the other half still covered, the job abandoned exactly midway through a pass. No footprints leading away. Nothing. I stood out in the cold for a few minutes, scanning the street in both directions. Then I went back inside and sat on the couch in the dark and didn't sleep again until morning. It happened the next night and the night after that. Same time, same figure, same slow, mechanical rhythm from the driveway while the rest of the neighborhood stayed perfectly sealed and silent. And every single time, by the time I got downstairs and opened that front door, he was already gone. It didn't matter how fast I moved. It didn't matter if I skipped putting shoes on or went straight from the window without stopping. He was never there when I got outside. Just the half-finished driveway, the cold air, and that specific silence that felt less like quiet and more like something holding its breath. By the fourth night, I stopped going downstairs. I'd just stand at the window and watch him until he finished, or until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. I told myself I was gathering information. Really, I think I was just too scared to find out what would happen if I actually caught him. By the fifth night, I noticed something that turned the unease into something heavier. He never looked up at the window. Not once in all those nights did he tilt his head or glance toward the house. He just worked, slow and steady, like he already knew exactly where I was, like he didn't need to look. On the sixth night, he didn't come. I woke at 2 a.m. anyway. My body had already learned the schedule and lay there in the dark waiting for the scraping sound. It never came. The street outside was silent. The driveway, when I checked, was empty and still. And I didn't feel relieved. I felt something closer to dread, like the absence of him was somehow worse than his presence had been. I told myself it was over, that whatever strange chapter that was, it had closed on its own. Then I walked downstairs the next morning and smelled it. It hit me halfway down the stairs. Thick, organic, wrong in a way that was hard to name. Not garbage, not mildew. Something older than that. Something that made the back of my throat tighten before my brain had even finished processing it. I went through every room, checked under the sink, behind the appliances, inside every cabinet, opened windows, found nothing. By early afternoon, the smell had thinned enough that I could convince myself it was the pipes, or something that had been left behind by whoever lived here before me, or just the particular way old houses breathe in winter. I closed the windows and let it go. It was back the next evening when I got home from work. Stronger this time. I did another sweep of the house, slower, more deliberate, and that's when I found it. The back sliding door. The latch was flipped up, unlocked. I stood there and stared at it for a long moment. That door was the last thing I checked every night before bed. I had a specific routine: front door, back door, windows. I had not opened that door once since moving in. There was nothing in the backyard I needed. And yet the latch was up. I slid the door open and stepped outside. The backyard was small and fenced on both sides, but open at the back, where the property just dissolved into tree lines. Dark woods, no lights, no movement. I stood there long enough to feel the cold settle into my jacket, then went back inside, locked the door, and checked it twice. I didn't sleep well that night, but I told myself I'd made a mistake, that I must have bumped the latch at some point without noticing. I told myself that because the alternative wasn't something I was ready to sit with yet. 2 nights later, I woke to dripping water. It was slow and rhythmic, echoing through the ground floor. I assumed I'd left the kitchen tap slightly open. It had happened once before, and dragged myself out of bed without fully waking up. The house was dark. I moved through the hallway toward the kitchen on autopilot, still half asleep, not thinking. The smell hit me before I reached the doorway. Full force, so thick it snapped me awake instantly. I stopped at the sink. The tap was dripping, just like I'd thought. I reached out and pushed the handle down to stop it. Then I looked at what was in the basin. I couldn't tell what it was. The kitchen was dark and I hadn't turned the lights on, and whatever was in that sink had been torn apart badly enough that shape and form were gone. It was wedged partway into the drain. It smelled like something that had been dead for days. I pulled my eyes from the sink to the back door. The latch was up. Someone had been inside my home. Not once. For days. I didn't move. I don't know how long I stood there in front of that sink, staring at the unlocked door, my brain running through every possible explanation and discarding all of them one by one. The smell was everywhere. Whatever was in that drain had been there long enough to settle into the walls, the air, the back of my throat, and I hadn't noticed it getting worse each day. I'd explained it away each time, but standing there in the dark with the latch flipped up and something decomposing in my kitchen sink, the full weight of the last several days landed on me all at once. Then I heard footsteps. They came from the room directly to my left. The small utility room off the kitchen that I used for nothing, had barely looked at since moving in. Heavy, unhurried footsteps. Not someone who had been startled. Not someone trying to run. Someone moving with the particular calm of a person who didn't yet know they'd been heard. I stopped breathing. The footsteps crossed the utility room and entered the kitchen. I was pressed against the counter on the opposite side, close enough to the hallway to run, but too terrified to move, certain that any sound I made would change whatever was about to happen. I heard something wet and heavy being forced into the drain beside me, pushed and packed down, and methodical, like a task being completed. Then the garbage disposal turned on. The sound of it tore through the silence and I used it, moved fast and silent into the hallway while the noise covered me, reached the base of the stairs and started up. I didn't run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I climbed those stairs one careful step at a time, keeping my weight to the edges where the wood was least likely to creak. Eyes fixed on the dark hallway below me. The disposal turned off. Silence poured back into the house, and then I heard him breathe, deep and slow, the way a person breathes when they're standing still, when they're listening. It came from the kitchen, close to the base of the stairs, and it was the most frightening sound I have ever heard in my life because of how calm it was. There was no panic in it, no urgency, just a man breathing in the dark of my kitchen at 2 a.m., like he had every right to be there. I got to my bedroom, so closed the door without a sound, locked it. I sat on the edge of the bed in complete darkness with my phone in both hands and dialed 911. I whispered the address. I whispered that someone was inside my house. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and stay where I was. I sat there for 5 minutes, which felt like an hour. Then I heard the back door slide open and shut, and then nothing. Just the house, settling into silence around me like it always had. The officer arrived 8 minutes later. He found the back door open. He found me sitting on the bedroom floor with my back against the wall. He found the kitchen drain packed with what a second officer and later an investigator determined to be the dismembered remains of a large animal, deposited in pieces over multiple separate visits, through a door that should have been locked. I sat on the porch in the cold while they worked inside. I couldn't stop staring at the driveway. One or half of me still expected to see him out there, shoveling. I sat on the front porch in my jacket with a blanket one of the officers had handed me, watching the lights move from window to window as they worked through each room. Neighbors had started to appear by then, finally, standing at the edges of their driveways in the dark, watching the patrol cars with that particular expression people wear when something terrible happens close enough to feel, but far enough to observe safely. Yet nobody came over to ask if I was okay. I noticed that. After a week of not a single person acknowledging my existence on this street, they all came outside for this. The lead investigator sat with me for a long time. He was patient and thorough, and I told him everything: the shoveling, the nights at the window, the smell, the unlocked door, the thing in the sink. He wrote it all down without reacting much. When I described the man, tall, dark clothing, hollow-eyed, with that slow, mechanical way of moving, he nodded slowly like he was filing it somewhere. He didn't tell me they'd find him. He didn't tell me anything that felt like a promise. What they found in the drain was worse than I'd let myself imagine in the dark. An investigator told me later, in the careful, flattened language people use when they're trying to deliver something disturbing without triggering a breakdown, or that the remains appeared to be from a large animal, likely a deer, that had been broken down and deposited in sections. Not all at once, over several visits. The drain had been used as a disposal point deliberately, repeatedly, by someone who knew the layout of the kitchen. Someone who knew exactly where the garbage disposal was and how to access the house without forcing anything. No signs of a break-in, not once. Every entry had been through the back sliding door. They never found him. With no fingerprints that produced a match, no footage. I had no cameras. None of my neighbors' angles caught the back of my property. No one on the street admitted to seeing anything unusual in the weeks before or after. The description I gave generated no leads. The man I had watched from my bedroom window for 5 consecutive nights, the man who had been moving through my home while I slept, with the man who had been standing in my kitchen breathing in the dark while I crept up the stairs above him. He left no official trace of himself behind. No name, no record, nothing. It was a neighbor 3 houses down who told me, almost as an afterthought, about 2 weeks after everything happened, that the house had been vacant for 8 months before I moved in. The previous owners had relocated for work, and the property had sat empty through the spring, summer, and into the fall. 8 months of an empty house on a quiet street where nobody paid much attention to what happened in other people's driveways. I thought about that for a long time. What 8 months of uninterrupted access to an empty house looks like to someone like Dorian Creed. How a routine becomes a habit. How a habit becomes something you don't give up easily, even when the circumstances change. Even when someone new signs a lease and moves their boxes in and starts sleeping 20 feet from where you've been working in the dark. I moved out within the month. I didn't try to break the lease cleanly. I just left, paid what I owed, and didn't look back. The property was relisted. Someone else moved in. I checked months later out of something I can only describe as compulsion. The new occupant reported nothing unusual. No sounds, no smells, no figure at 2 a.m. They're working the driveway in the dark. I'm glad for them. I genuinely am, but I still check my driveway at 2 a.m. Not every night, but enough. Whatever house I'm in, whatever city, I find myself awake at that hour, moving to the window without fully deciding to. Looking down at the street below. Some part of me is still waiting to see him out there, patient, unhurried, like he has nowhere else to be. And that's where I'll leave it, because that's where it lives in me, unresolved, unfinished. The way real things usually are. If this story got under your skin the way it still gets under mine, take a second and hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. And if you're new here, subscribe. I put out stories every week, and I promise they don't get any less unsettling than this. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done differently? At what point would you have called the police? Because I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. Share this with someone who thinks they'd never be afraid to move somewhere new. Let's find out. I'll see you in the next one. Stay aware of who's outside your window tonight.